Hey everybody, welcome to another making of video. This one's going to be a lot like my previous video where I showed the process of making the Runaway Nuns poster. This time I'm going to be talking about this Death Panthers poster that I finished off the end of March this year. So yeah, let's dive right in and I'll show you the process from start to finish of how I made this. So as always, I started with a sketch. Now a lot of the time I will use a sort of pencil. I'll often rarely use a pencil, but a lot of the time I'm drawing on my tablet here. By the way, I'm using a Cintiq Pro 24 HD. No, it's not even a 24 HD. This is the Cintiq Pro 24. I think that's the name of it. And I'm using Clip Studio Paint, which is a different program to Photoshop. A lot of people use Photoshop. I really prefer Clip Studio Paint. I like the way that it handles brushes and pen pressure and that sort of thing. So a lot of the time I will use a sort of pencil and I'll come up with these sketches and I'll figure out exactly what I want to do. If I'm going to do, a skull with crossbones or whatever. But this time I decided to go just straight to color because I knew what I was going to do. I had the idea already. So I just went straight into shapes and color for the layout. So for this poster, I knew what I wanted to do, which was I wanted to base this entire poster off of t-shirts and t-shirt designs. I have this fantastic book, which I've got a photo of here to show you. It's called Rock T-Shirts Museum. I picked it up when I was in Hong Kong and I really loved it. It's just a small book of photographed t-shirts from tours and album launches and that sort of thing from the 70s and 80s and 90s. And that really inspired me. I then looked at two t-shirts that I bought back in 2004 and I wore so much that they started falling apart. Now the name of the show was Death Panthers Relapse, and I had the idea to basically interpret relapse as someone taking out a shirt that they hadn't really worn for a very long time and wearing it again. So these are two shirts that I don't really wear that much anymore, mostly because they're just falling apart. And I decided to base the entire design off of them. So the first thing I did was I looked at the shape of the t-shirts and I did a really rough sketch of it. So I used the collar of this shirt, the Thin Lizzy shirt on the right hand side here, because I felt like this one on the left, the Guns N' Roses shirt, not having a collar, I felt like it wasn't going to read as quickly as a t-shirt. So I knew I wanted to have that collar involved. So I painted in a bit of a sort of like blue color here to give it the form of a t-shirt, and that was my basis for the design. I didn't know what I was going to do for the design just yet. I just knew that I wanted it to exist on a t-shirt. So that was the first thing I did. Next up, I started playing with some ideas. Oh, here's a bit more detail. I put that label in there for the t-shirt. So next thing, I started playing around with some ideas for what would go on the t-shirt. And the first thing I did was here, that was the rough layout. I knew I wanted to have the type at the top and have some sort of a graphic in the middle, and then at the bottom would be the details for the poster, the other bands playing, the cost, the time, the date, etc. So I just roughly drew that in, and then I started messing around with what could go there. So first I tried a snake wrapped around a skull. I tried a skull with flames around it and a rose in its mouth. I was not really thinking outside the box here. I wanted it to have that sort of rock and roll feel, that real kind of classic look to it. And obviously playing off this Guns N' Roses t-shirt on the left-hand side, which I had these things next to me while I was working on this the entire time. So I just tried a few different things. I then tried, I took the layout of Death Panthers from this one, and a lot of this is I'm working very, very quickly and I'm just drawing on top of things. I'm creating more iterations. So I just took this very quick title of Death Panthers here. I reduced the opacity of it and I drew in a bit of a better version. This took me really quick. I was just playing around here. None of this is going to be final. So I'm just, trying different things. I put a couple of daggers next to it because I really wanted to go over the top with this. And then I just started thinking of things that could fill that space. So I already had the skull with the rose. Tried this sort of shape, trying to think of what I could put in there, but that didn't really work. I tried a rose and a separate title there. Wasn't really sure of the rose. It wasn't really that good of an idea. Then I tried a knuckle duster with a snake wrapped around it. Also, it just didn't really feel right. At this point, I just decided that the skull with the rose in its mouth was probably the closest thing I wanted to put on the t-shirt. So I was just going to roll with that, because I can always change that later on, as long as the layout of the design is the same. So as long as you've got type here and some sort of graphic over here and then the dates at the bottom, I knew that that's what it was going to look like. So I was happy to just proceed with that. It ended up obviously being the final, but at this point I wasn't sure. I was just, trying to get this rolling as quickly as possible. So then I quickly filled in what I thought that the type could look like at the bottom. Again, that ended up being basically exactly what I used, but at this point you don't need to have anything final on your layout. As long as it's the layout that you're happy with, the finer details you can change later on. So I was pretty happy with that, and the next thing I did was blow this up really big so that I could work on it at a slightly higher size. So I just enlarged it, made it big. And at this point I didn't do too much more to it. I just refined some of the elements. You'll see that the skull is done just a little bit better on this one. But I just needed to get it to a point where I was ready to take it to the next level, or at least the next stage of the design. I put a bit of texture on it just to give it an idea of what the final would look like, and then this is what I sent off to the band. I think at this point I had decided that I would do the skull with the rose, but this was going to be developed a lot more, and this was good enough to send to the band to show them what the final poster would look like. So that's how that looked. And then I moved on to the next stage. So I took that design, and it was time to now sketch this up to something that was tighter and much neater so that I could make the final from it. So I took the sketch and I dropped the opacity of the sketch. And this now allows me to draw on top of it and refine everything. So I just went in and I started refining the skull, the design of everything. But at this point I'm also starting to use references. And you'll see here I've got this skull, and this is the skull that I used for the reference. So where is that? Here you go. So using that skull, and I have this basically on my screen at all times so that I can refer back to it when I'm drawing. Using that skull, I started to develop the sketch. So this is the first iteration of the skull that I drew. You'll see it's very similar. I'm just getting the basic shape and that sort of thing. Now that's very plain, that's very generic, that skull. So I started developing it. And you'll see I just make slight differences as I move along. I didn't redraw this, I was just basically going in and saying, okay, this line here, let's move that up a bit. And then I'll erase, and I use a lot of just bringing things in and erasing other things, and just developing it as I go along. So that was the second iteration of the skull, and I went for the third one. At this point, I decided to put some horns on the skull, and that's the one I used, I think, for the final sketch. So this is good enough for me to ink from it. This is perfect to move forward with the illustration. Then I put some eyes on the skull, and once I was happy with the skull and the rose and all of that, then I could start moving on to the rest of the elements. So one of the main things I did next was I drew the outlines for the shirt. The shirt was one of the quickest things to do because having these references for my shirt made it very, very easy to just sketch it up and have it look exactly like I wanted it. So I just did the outlines. I also added in, you'll see here, these are just shapes that I'm going to later fill in with that blue color, like this over here, and that's going to give it the real form of a t-shirt. So that was the shirt, and then I started adding in the type. So the type at the bottom that says relapse, that was just going to be on a scroll. That was very easy to do. I've drawn tons of scrolls, so doing something like that didn't take very long. The type for relapse, at this point, I wasn't completely settled on it, and I know I can develop that later, so that was more of a placeholder than anything else. You also notice that the scroll is mirrored. So all I really did was draw this side over here, and then I flipped it to the other side so that it was a perfectly symmetrical scroll. So when I drew it up, I think I drew it up without mirroring my ink, because I kind of like how then it doesn't have a perfectly symmetrical look to it, even though the pencil sketch is symmetrical, the ink isn't. So, but at this point, I was very happy to just, save myself some time, save myself some effort, and just mirror that scroll. Next up, I drew in the Death Panthers type. So, first thing is I gave myself some guides for where the type was going to sit. And this is basically the process for doing any custom type, at least for me, is the first thing I do is I give myself some boundaries. So I drew these in. You'll see they're also symmetrical. Everything is flipped along the center line here so that it is symmetrical, so that when I draw it up, it does look considered. It does look like it's kind of held together. Even though it's not super neat, it at least has these guides involved. So now I know that the D has to fit in this space. The E has to fit in this space. The A has to fit in this space, and so on for all the letters. And even though this type in the background was very, very rough, it is perfect for allowing me to then start drawing over it and get something quite neat out of it. Even though it's rough, it's exactly what I need to go in and do the final sketch. So I drew up the final sketch here, and you'll notice that I kind of freestyled some of this stuff, and I gave it a bit of detailing with these little notches cut out of the type, just to give it a bit more of like a gritty feel, which is what I was going for in the title. So the title is then done, and I think next I moved on to the type at the bottom of the t-shirt. And here you can see again, I'm starting just with guides. I'm just starting to say, okay, the date and the venue are going to fit into this box. Here's the space for this band, here's the space for this band, and so on. And that means that when this is drawn up, it's just going to look like a very cohesive, considered design, and it's not just going to be all over the place. Sometimes you want that, but most of the time you want things to have a bit of structure. And once you take away these boxes, it's not going to look perfectly square. It's not going to look perfect at all, but it's just going to give it that structure once it's drawn up. So I then drew in all the type, and this I just drew directly on top. I've done lots of type, so I'm quite happy to take something as rough as, for instance, this Runaway Nuns here, and just go straight over it and draw that in. Here's a different idea for that type at the top, which I didn't really like. I started drawing that up. I wasn't very happy with it, so I just went with that. And yeah, around this point, I was pretty happy with how this was looking. So I was ready to move on to the next stage. So this is what it looks like now. This is my final pencil, and now I'm ready to move to a final with this because it's very neat, it's very tight. All I'm going to do from here is start drawing over it. So that was good enough. So the next thing I do is I colorize the layer, and this is something that you can do in Clip Studio, which is great, is just by clicking this button here, it immediately colorizes the entire layer. You can change that color if you wanted to make it red, for instance. But blue works just fine because I'm going to draw black over it. So I colorize the layer, I drop the opacity, and then I start inking it. So I began by inking the skull, and when I'm inking, I just zoom right in here, as close as I want to, and I get my brush, which is this one that I use the most, and I just start inking the lines. So usually, I don't know where I usually start, but it's kind of different every time. But then I just start inking, and I usually will start with the face or something more important like that, because it will give a feel for how the rest of it's going to be inked. Now this one, there wasn't a lot of stuff to draw, so I didn't take very long to get this stuff inked up, but I just went in and started drawing it up. So I drew up the skull, filled in the eyes, filled in some detailing on the horns and the face, and dropped in some shadows. This is just at the point that this document is in. I'm going to move over to the next one in a moment, but for this one, that's how far I got with the inking. Then I dropped in the background color and the flames around the head and the t-shirt color, and then I dropped in the color for the actual skull and the rose, and I started dropping in the color for the t-shirt. So you'll see it's a very quick transformation to go from the sketch to where that is, where the t-shirt, all I did was ink the outlines for the t-shirt and fill it in with black. With the flames around the head, I just traced the outlines of the flame, filled that in, and then did the ink, dropped in the color, and now at the point where this design is getting close to what I'm wanting. At this point, I then also drew in the type. So again, I'm using this layer of pencil to give me the guide for how that type's going to look. And I just had that low opacity in the background, and I drew in the type. And the type was really quick to draw up because I didn't care about being too neat with this. If you go in and you really look at it, there's no real straight lines going on at all. This is all very, loose. And so all I'm really doing here is, again, I'm taking the exact same brush that I used for the inking. It's just a bit bigger. That's about how much pressure sensitivity is going on here. And I'm just doing the outline. But you see, I didn't have to do it very slowly because I didn't have to care about getting these lines neat. In fact, I sort of wanted them to be a bit rough and a bit loose because it fit the vibe of the t-shirt. So I'm just going along. I'm interpreting my sketch as I go. So I'm not sticking to it perfectly. It's however I feel it needs to look. And I just went through, I added in detailing whenever I wanted. And I did that for every single letter. And then at the end, I just filled it in. And I mean, that's how quick it takes to do one letter. So it didn't take that long to do all of it. And I reached this point, which was, close enough to move to the next document. So I'm going to go here. This is the document with the final illustration on it, but I'm going to build it up as we go. So there's not much difference except for the color. You'll notice I added in all that detail. So this color is now done. You can see it really gives form to the t-shirt. Compared to this one, it's kind of more like just a black shape. You go to this one and you can kind of feel that it's fabric and it's got some folds and that sort of thing in it. So taking it from here, let's see where we go. Taking it from here, I added in some more ink. Yeah, I think that's the next thing that came with this. So I added in all the detail for the skull. And that's just going in and thinking about where the light's coming from. I'm looking at this, my reference again, figuring out where the light's coming from, and then I'm just dropping in those shadows and that detail on the rose also, and the scroll. So already now that's making a big difference with that color from the t-shirt and dropping in the shadows. It's getting there. And from here, I started with the rest of the type, I think. So again, I have those guides. Where are those guides? Oh, I had the sketch on again. And I went in and I started drawing in this type at the bottom. And again, not caring too much about being too accurate with the type. You'll see that there's a lot of weird weighting. The U over here is a lot thinner than this N, but it doesn't really matter because that's sort of the approach I was taking with this poster, is a bit more fast and loose and more fun and, just going for that sort of a design. Then I drew in these extra elements. That little word there. And I carried on, and the whole time I'm doing this, I'm trying out different things. For instance, these thunderbolts here, they didn't make it into the final design, mostly because when I design, I really like to have a lot of color blocking. So you'll notice I kind of go, hang on, let me get a nice pencil going on here. So I like to kind of go white, black, red, and always have different colors sit next to each other. So for this part over here, where I have white here and red here, I didn't want to have white in between them again, because there's not a nice contrast between those. I wanted to have white and then red, and then white and then red, etc., etc. It's the same with the skull. You've got the white of the skull here, then the red of the flames, and then the white of the scroll over here. It's just something that I like. It's a sort of a very graphic approach to design, which I really like. So I didn't really want to have those thunderbolts there. I tried many different ways of putting them in there. I tried making them red, but then the opposite things happen, where that's red and the type below it is red, and yeah, I didn't want that. So I just left them out, because anything that doesn't need to be there shouldn't be there, in my opinion. So I just made it simpler, left those out. I tried a few other things along the way. There's a version of this poster, which, let me see if I can find it here, where I shaded the skull. But you see, that just introduces, I think, too much detail. I didn't really like how that was looking, so I just left that out. I also added some highlights to the rose, but again, it didn't feel like a t-shirt design then to me. It felt too graphic. Well, not too graphic, it felt less graphic, and it felt too rendered, I guess, for what I was going for, which was just a straight t-shirt design. So I left that out. But the type then for relapse, at this point I didn't really know what I wanted to do for that. So I tried a sort of very rough looking design, well, a rough looking style for the type there. That I wasn't really feeling. Then I tried something very simple, didn't really like that either. And then I drew this up, which was a kind of weirdly sort of 70s-ish type with some like smooth serifs, everything very rounded, which I quite liked. So I took that and I gave myself a boundary box, which by this point you probably understand what I'm talking about with that. And using this very rough type that I made and this boundary box, I drew up that type. So again, I didn't develop it too much, I just went for it, and I was really happy with how that looked. I think that having something like that, having a sort of softer looking type, it set it off from the title and the type at the bottom, which are all very quite hard edged. So I was quite happy with that. Dropped in a couple thunderbolts, because why not? And that was pretty much the type done. So at this point the poster's almost finished. I was just looking to add some last bits and pieces to really kind of finish it off. So I added some texture on the actual shirt, just to give it a bit more of, like, I guess, interest, visual interest, and so that it's not just a lot of blank black around the design. Added in a thunderbolt on the label at the top, and then I textured the whole image with this black sort of spray. And when I did this, I again looked at the shirts that I had, especially this Thin Lizzy one, and I looked at how a real t-shirt weathers. You'll notice that in some places there's not a lot of weathering, like at the top of the H here, but then other places like here, there's a lot of weathering. So I was trying to go for that in the poster. I was trying to get the sort of feel of some places being more worn than others. So I textured everything up, and then lastly I added a bit of texture for the background, just so everything kind of felt together and cohesive. And that was it. That was the final poster. So this didn't take that long for me to do. It probably took me about 2 days, start to finish, maybe 2.5 days. But I was really happy with how it came out. I think that this is one of those few posters where I had the idea and I sort of knew that it would work immediately. And when I started drawing it up, everything just came together really quickly. I've had designs that seem simple that have taken me forever to do, but with this one, everything came together pretty well. So I was really happy with it. It was a really good experience, start to finish. Anything that doesn't take a lot of effort and that goes well is always a good experience in my books. So yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I hope that this making a video was helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and post them. I'll respond to everything that's posted, and I will hopefully do more of these. I'm wanting to do another one very soon for a poster that I just finished off, so look out for that soon. But otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and yeah, I'll catch you next time.